In this lecture, we're going to talk about rulemaking, the process by which agencies issue regulations. But before we talk about the process, what are these regulations? What exactly is this that we're talking about? Well, the government, both the federal government and state governments, have regulations on just about every single aspect of life. And I really encourage you to go to regulations.gov, which is the federal government's depository of all federal regulations. It's a really fantastic site, and it's extremely user-friendly, extremely informative, and I encourage all public administration students to check it out. California has a similar site that we'll explore, but it's not quite as user-friendly. But this is regulations.gov, and if you're interested in a particular subject, all you got to do is go to the search terms. And so I'm interested in trucking and transportation. I teach in the Mineta Transportation Institute. So let's see what the federal government's got with regard to trucking driving limits. And if we search for that, we see that lots and lots of different regulations come up in various different stages of the process. I just chose one of them. This is a rule that was issued by the Department of Transportation back in 2004, and these are just really interesting to take a look at, and we'll highlight some of this later on. But the rule itself is contained at the very end, so if you go to one of these and download it, the text of the rule itself is at the end, but you can tell it's very long, and the rest of it does is it explains the rule. Why did we adopt this? How does the rule relate to the Environmental Protection Act and other acts? Just all kinds of information, the evidence that we use, the reasons why the law was enacted. And what this particular rule does is it simply requires trucking companies to engage in a more rigorous background check process when hiring truckers. So the purpose of this rule, of course, is to achieve greater safety in the trucking industry, and the way that it proposes to do that is by requiring trucking companies to do more background checks. So that's just one of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of rules that exist out there. But you'll notice, just for a simple rule like that, which seems to make common sense, there's a extensive justification that references not only the scientific record, but the comments that were received by trucking companies. It summarizes the arguments for and against. So it's a very thorough document. And again, I highly encourage you to just play around with regulations.gov at your leisure and to see what it's got available for you. So how does rulemaking proceed? Well, if you'll recall, there are two different ways to engage in rulemaking: informal rulemaking and formal rulemaking. At this point, we're just going to introduce the bare outlines of the process. As we go forward, we'll have more to say about each part of the process. But first, let's talk about informal rulemaking, which is by far more common of the two. Now, rulemaking is addressed in the APA in Section 553, so it's possible that some of you, for the papers that you're working on, may encounter Section 553 if your topic has to do with the agency's rulemaking power. But in informal rulemaking, the agency is first required to publish a general notice of proposed rulemaking. Before an agency can issue a rule, it has to notify the public that it's going to issue a rule. And this certainly seems to satisfy some of the most fundamental notions of due process. Government shouldn't do anything without notifying people beforehand that it's going to do that. And so the main way that the government publishes a general notice of proposed rulemaking is, once again, through regulations.gov. And so anytime there's a new rule that an agency is thinking about, it gets put up onto the website. And then the public has an opportunity to submit written comments. And regulation.gov has made it very easy to submit written comments and to find which regulations are up for comment. Once upon a time, it was difficult for the general public to figure out or to even know when an agency was considering a rule. Today, all you got to do is go to regulations.gov. You can find all the pending rules very easily, and you can search for them. You can see here listed on the front page rules that are about to be, the comment period's about to expire are featured right here. A link to them right on the opening page. And so individuals have an opportunity to comment, and you can read their comments right here on the website. So this is all part of informal rulemaking, and the agency has to read and consider the comments. Now, most rules do not attract very many comments, so this isn't usually very difficult to do, but the agency has to read and consider the comments. And then when it publishes a final rule, it has to include a statement of basis and purpose, which is the document I showed you earlier that explains why the agency issued the rule. And then the final rule has to be published for 30 days before taking effect. That's to give the affected industries and individuals an opportunity to comply. So they've got 30 days to comply, and sometimes the agency will extend that 30-day time period. So that's informal rulemaking. What about formal rulemaking? Well, once again, the agency has to publish a general notice of proposed rulemaking, just as informal rulemaking. But with regard to formal rulemaking, soliciting comments is not sufficient. They've got to do more than that, and you should already know what it is that they have to do, because we talked about the difference between a formal and an informal proceeding. In formal rulemaking, the agency has to hold a formal hearing. That means it has to be a full trial-like hearing with witnesses and the opportunity to cross-examine them and the presentation of evidence and so on and so forth. Then, just as under informal rulemaking, the agency publishes the final rule, including the statement of basis and purpose. And again, one of the differences between formal and informal rulemaking is that the decision must be based on the record. So only information that came up at the formal hearing or that were solicited as part of the comment period can be considered, and everything that's included in the decision must be part of the record that's been established. And again, just like informal rulemaking, the rule has to be published 30 days before taking effect. So as you can see, the general structure is the same. You've got to provide notice to the public that the agency is considering a rule. Comments have to be considered and taken, and the rule has to be published 30 days before taking effect. The difference, of course, between formal and informal rulemaking is that hearing that's required in formal rulemaking and the requirement the decision must be based on the record. So that's the difference between formal and informal rulemaking. In our next lecture, we're going to get into the specifics of this process a little bit more, starting with informal rulemaking.